Good. Okay, we're going to get started. I'm Dan Rundy. I hold the Schreier Chair here at CSIS. We're having a conversation today about international organizations and the refugee crisis. I think many of you are aware that we have the highest number of refugees and internally displaced people since World War II. I think it's over 65 million. There have been a series of summits and meetings in the last year. Whatever meetings we've had are probably not enough to respond to the enormity of this task. This is going to be a problem that's going to be with us for decades. The folks that are refugees stay longer as refugees. Conflicts are lasting longer, and so there's a whole series of reasons why this is happening, and we can talk about some of those reasons. In the past, perhaps during the Cold War, many conflicts that were kind of underneath the surface were kept under wraps, if you will, and with the end of the Cold War and a series of things that have happened since then, that's one of the pieces. There are a whole series of other reasons as well. You know, the good news is that there's a whole series of countries that are joining the ranks of middle-income countries, but there's 20 or 30 countries that are fragile and vulnerable, and some people call them the bottom billion. They're of the folks that are in those, oftentimes in those countries, and so I think development agencies and emergency agencies are going to have to be thinking a lot more and a lot harder about fragility and vulnerable states and refugees and how to confront this challenge of the bottom billion. It's one of the major challenges that we're going to have to face. And so a variety of institutions, including the World Bank Group and others, are responding. So I think we're going to hear about that today. So we have three very thoughtful speakers. We have Dr. Matthew McGuire, who's the U.S. Executive Director at the World Bank. He represents the United States. He's sort of the U.S. ambassador to the World Bank. That's not exactly his title, but that's the concept. My friend Jon Brause, who's a Managing Director at the World Food Program, had a very distinguished career at USAID. He served on the National Security Council. This is his second. He's had 2 stints in government, U.S. government, and 2 stints now at the World Food Program. Thanks for being here, Jon. And then my new friend, let's see if I can get this, Nina Nieuwoudt.
There we go.
It's good, right?
Absolutely.
Nina Nieuwoudt. Mastercard's Global Product Development, Public Sector, and Humanitarian Solutions Branch leader. So thanks for being here, Nina.
Thank you.
We really appreciate it. So we're going to have a private sector perspective to this conversation as well. So we're going to hear from the perspective from the World Bank, perspective from someone who thinks about this from an emergency response perspective from the World Food Program. Then we're going to hear about a perspective from the private sector. So I'm going to start first with Dr. McGuire. Can you tell us a little bit about how the World Bank is thinking about this refugee crisis? Thanks for being here.
Yes, and let me just make sure I have this on. Okay, I think that'll work. Can everyone hear me? Great. And by the way, it's Matt. People call me Dr. McGuire. I get nervous and think they're going to ask me about their elbow or their back or something. So,
I do have a couple questions.
Well, thank you very much. Let me pick up on what you were saying there about what the challenge is from a development perspective. So as Dan mentioned, there are a number of things that have occurred over the last 20, 30 years that have led to some of these conflicts. The other thing from a World Bank or a development perspective is that part of the huge shifts that we've seen over the last 30 years have included a real decrease in people living in extreme poverty around the world. So a lot of that is driven by the liberalization of China and India's economy, then the subsequent demand for commodities that's helped any number of other countries to rise and grow incomes as they sell into those in other markets. And there are a number of other trends, but the point is about...
We're having a technical difficulty.
Okay. The point of that is that... let me turn this one off.
It's not a wardrobe malfunction so much as a sound malfunction.
There we go. So the only point of which is that we've seen a real shift, and a lot of the problems that we're looking at now when we talk about raising people out of extreme poverty around the world are ones where we have to really focus much more. So it's in fragile and conflict states, it's in very particular environments where we're seeing a particular set of solutions that are going to need to be brought to bear. It's not to say that the problems are over in all the rest of the world, or that getting out of extreme poverty is the end point. We clearly have a lot more to do, but the point is that the types of solutions institutions are having to get a bit more focused. The thing I would say, and this goes to my colleagues who are up here, is one of the ways we have to think about solving a lot of these big economic development challenges is in partnering in different ways with different types of institutions. So the UN and its agencies, like the World Food Program, historically has been thought of as doing one set of things related to humanitarian issues. The World Bank has been thought of as doing a separate set of issues related to development. These are really merging, and then of course the big player who's more increasingly on the scene in our conversations is the private sector and the trillions and trillions of dollars of capital that are sitting on the sidelines, as it were, and not working in some of these countries as much as they might be. So what I would say is the big challenge as we think about it is how do we turn humanitarian crises into development opportunities? Now that may sound a little too buzzy and a little too like some grand idea that people have, but what I would say is a way for us to think about this a little bit is that clearly a lot of the people who cross borders and flee have extraordinary talents. And some of them will have talents in the agricultural sector, others are trained as engineers, but the point is there are a lot of people and the influx into another country can often be an opportunity. The one statistic I would point to, which is not directly related but maybe gives a framework for how some of us think about this, is if you look at the Fortune 500 companies in the United States, 40% were founded by immigrants or children of immigrants. And the point is the core strength of our economy has been our ability to absorb people coming from other places. Now, are they refugees? Are they economic migrants? Did they flee the Great Potato Famine? There are any number of reasons why people move, but the point is when you do have an influx, there can be an opportunity there. The few other things I'll say, and then let me stop, is that the other way we think about it as a development institution is that refugee crises are not short-term challenges. People tend to stay 9 years, 12 years, 15 years, 20 years. We've seen this over the decades. And so you can't approach these crises thinking we will solve the immediate challenges someone has and then we're done, because people tend to stay in these host communities for a long, long time. So thinking longer term means you then have to think about what are the sorts of things development institutions are particularly good at: building infrastructure, strengthening healthcare systems, educational systems, thinking about any number of other things which really go to the long-term health and development of that country. That's the sort of thing that the World Bank has expertise in, has money ready to lend and invest for, and is the place where we can come in and make a difference. Then the final thing I'll say is the other way the bank is thinking about this is on how do we create the regulatory and legal environments in particular countries that are hosting refugees that will allow, encourage, incentivize private sector actors to come in and invest more regularly and in bigger ways, because that really is what unlocks economic growth over time. So we have expertise in thinking about judicial systems and rule of law and labor market reforms and any number of other things, and part of our task is shifting those dynamics so that then so many other private actors will come in, or those who are already there will grow and will expand and hire more people and create more economic activity.
Great.
So I think I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. Jon, thanks for being here. So what is the World Food Program doing to respond to this global refugee crisis?
Thanks, Dan. Well, WFP's in the middle of it. We're supporting 6.6 million refugees around the world in 32 different countries. So we are now, and we have been, involved in supporting refugees. But I think the interesting thing for us in this context, or in this discussion, is the fact that
your microphone's actually working.
Okay,
I think is
so
what
I'm
ours.
double.
So you just turned, yeah, you doubled.
Okay.
It's like belt
You'll
and
show me how to do it.
suspenders, but
Yeah.
Just
The interesting thing now is that the global refugee crisis has changed. There's a different context to it than there has been, in the past. We remember, and there were refugees in Africa and Asia and what have you, and they were always, and I don't mean this in any way crass, but they were over there, and we didn't necessarily...
Out of sight, out of mind.
Sort of, yes, and the humanitarian community did its job and went in and did its best to help out. And also out of sight, out of mind was sort of how host countries were supported as well, so that it was just sort of deal with them as best you can.
In refugee camps in the rural areas, far away.
Now we have a context where we have millions of refugees right in the Middle East, right across from Europe, and they're not uneducated people. They're middle-class people in many cases. They're educated, and they have, in many ways, exactly the same aspirations that we have. And we have large numbers of refugees in countries that don't have the capacity to accommodate them, which isn't inconsistent with in the past, but it's, again, in a more middle income context. And so, as the President's Summit pointed out, the current response community structure has been overwhelmed, and it is not capable in its current structure in meeting the demands of this new refugee situation. So what are we doing? I say there are two levels to this. There's the humanitarian level that has to obviously continue and has to function, but has to function better. One of our colleagues earlier mentioned that the new refugee paradigm is one where refugees aren't as often in camps. They're in urban settings. They're mixing in with the communities. So this idea that you're just going to sort of gather them together and hand out resources and they'll all be fine, it no longer works. So that's where private sector partners come in. Just as an example, Mastercard was the teacher and the guide for the UN community to learn how to use the debit cards, the electronic cash cards, which we can give to refugees now and displaced people and even beneficiaries who are part of the local population, as we're doing in Lebanon, and they can go into local markets. They can buy what they need to buy, what they want to buy. They have choice. And this is the dignity aspect of this new construct. And we couldn't do that just a few years ago. And it's not only that can only be used in middle-income countries. Some aspects of that are also being moved into the other refugee situations as well. And so that's a great efficiency for us, but it's not just an efficiency. It's also a way of integrating the humanitarian activities into a broader developmental context. Because in Lebanon, just as an example, these cards are used by the beneficiaries in 450 shops. They're commercial shops. WFP didn't build the shops. They're commercial traders. And those shops have seen an infusion of $720 million over the last 3 years. That's the type of economic stimulus that these programs can put in because we have a new way of working, because of Mastercard and the skills Mastercard has shared with the community. So that's very important. The second level, though, is that we all recognize that countries like Lebanon that have taken in 20% of their population, the equivalent, imagine the United States taking in about 60 million people, and you get a general idea, they just don't have the infrastructure to support this level of additional people. And you have school children who can't go to school, you have hospitals that can't meet the demand, and then of course there are issues like jobs. So we need the development community, the broader development community, to bring the same response capacities, I would say. I mean, not the same ones, but their response capacities to these situations to enable the host governments to create an environment for the refugees that is stable. Because again, I mean, just to put it in the context of the refugees in Lebanon and in Jordan, if they don't see a future, these people who are as educated as we are, or more in many cases, and have the same aspirations, you can't tell them to sit for 9 or 10 years and expect them to stay there. They want their family to have opportunities just the way we want our families to have opportunities. So it's incumbent upon the global community, as again the President said in his summit, and the group of leaders for the summit said, it's a global responsibility to address these issues. And then I'm just going to end on the final point. Since so much of the refugee situation is created by conflict, neither the developmental community nor the humanitarian community is going to fix that. There's got to be a political solution, or we're going to continue to have these struggles. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Nina, thanks. So why is Mastercard involved in the refugee crisis, if I can put it that way?
It's core to our business. Our CEO often uses the words about doing well and doing good. And that's what we can do. We've got a global infrastructure which can be leveraged, and we can get aid to people really quickly, efficiently, and probably to many of your people's surprise as well, it's not just financial products like debit cards that we've made available. We've recently had a project out in the Philippines where they actually used our rails to get water vouchers to people. Okay, we've got products where we speak about commodities. It's close to our heart, and we speak about sustainability. So that is why Mastercard is involved here. We're building communities for a better tomorrow. irrespective of whether it's a refugee, somebody who's been displaced, or somebody who needs to be included financially or be on-ramped onto understanding how products work. We also feel that passionate about giving people an ability to keep their funds safe and then to give them dignity. Ultimately, this comes down to choice and dignity. And in the refugee crisis, people who have lost so much, the one refugee that I spoke to said, I don't have a choice about anything. He goes, I'm stuck in Greece right now. I don't have a choice of where I sleep tonight. I was told this is where my tent is. I don't have a choice on the clothes that my children wear. I was given, and this is what I have. And he goes, the only thing I have any choice over is this card. This card gives me the ability to go into a shop and decide what I want to buy. Gives me the decision or the ability to make the decision of whether I'm buying baby formula for my child or whether I'm buying medicine in case my child becomes ill. And that's the dignity that we bring and that we want to bring. And then there's the benefit, obviously, of the efficiency, the speed that we can bring, and the insights and the knowledge that we bring from the private sector to help our partners like WFP, Mercy Corps, Save the Children, and the likes.
Nia, you were recently in Greece. Could you just talk a little bit more about that trip that you made and some of the insights you had when you were there?
Sure. It was hugely insightful. It was probably one of the life-changing events which I can speak about. There's the preparation.
Who brought you?
Sure. So we went with Mercy Corps. We've got some of them here in the audience today, so thank you very much for that. And I think knowing myself well enough to knowing that I needed to prepare emotionally for what I expected to hear, I was prepared for some of the heartache stories, and you hear them. You speak to a mom who tells of how she left her 11-year-old son back in Syria, and as a mom myself, I just couldn't imagine that ever having to make that decision or going through that. So you absolutely hear that, and you sort of expect it or you've prepared to hear that. But there's the stuff that you're not prepared for that you hear. Okay, it's the stories of when people tell you that Athens has now become the world's capital of organ smuggling, and that had never crossed my mind. It's the stories of hearing that how in Greece, since the crisis started a year ago, that they've lost 10,000 children, that they know those children arrived within Greece and they no longer know where they are. Okay? Those are the stories that I wasn't prepared to hear, which makes me go, there's a bigger crisis here that we should be addressing. It's the stories of hearing when families tell you that, and at this point we met with a family, we were sitting down in their tent, and they had no idea that I was working for Mastercard. There were a number of us there. Airbnb was in the tent with us. There was a group of us sitting there, and we pretty much looked like Mercy Corps staff. We had our field vests on, our caps on, and they were telling us about their journey. And the father shared with us that they'd left Syria, and his wife was pregnant at the time, and they'd been shot at on the border. His wife went into early labor, the baby was born, the police caught them and sort of waved them on and said, you know what, your wife's in labor, baby's about to be born, but once baby's born, keep moving. They kept moving. They were then caught by the Coast Guard when they were crossing into Greece. The baby landed up in hospital for 17 days, and he goes, baby came out of hospital and they were now in the refugee camp. And he says his wife was not able to stomach the food that she was getting. She was really weak and frail. 2 small children. They were just in bad condition as a family. And he goes, we had literally made peace with the fact that we were going to die. He goes, we'd made the peace, we'd made that discussion, we've had the discussions, and that's where we were. And he goes, the Mercy Corps person came around the next day and gave me their Mastercard prepaid card. And he goes, when I got my card, it literally saved my life. And that is moving when you hear somebody saying that. And I was like, whoa, like, explain more to me, what does this mean? And he goes, for the first time, I had the ability to go and buy baby formula for my newborn baby who'd been so ill. For the first time, I had the ability to go buy food that my wife and my 2 young children could stomach. And when you hear things like that, you realize how much dignity the option of choice can actually bring to people. It was a moving time as well in understanding. We met with the mayor of Athens, and we met with the brigadier general of the military, who basically runs and manages all the refugee camps. And in both cases, I was really surprised with the personalities which came out and met us. The brigadier general, I was really expecting a very military-orientated person. And instead, a very compassionate man came out, and he spoke about how we need to understand that these are people. We cannot expect them to stay in tents in the middle of winter. They should not be living in boxes. But how do we do that, and how do we change that? Okay, he was like going, what does it feel like when you're going to a camp and people are asking for the basics like salt and pepper for the food that they're being serving? The things that we take for granted every day. When we spoke to the mayor of Athens, he was going, people think that this is the crisis right now. This is not the crisis. He says the crisis is to come. What about this generation of children which have lost 3 or 4 years of education? How do we correct that? He was like, how do we get them integrated? How do we cross the language barrier? We've got all these refugees coming into Greece. How do we speak them to speak Greek? How do we get them to be integrated in our communities without causing more disconnection? So it was really, really insightful, and it just gave a very different view of what that experience was like on the ground.
Thank you, Nina. Matt, I'd love for you to respond to that, but I'd also like you to talk about what exactly the World Bank is doing specifically to respond to this very dramatic picture that Nina just painted. I'd like you to talk about IDA 18, and also like to talk about some of the facilities in addition to responding, whatever you want to respond to. Thank you.
Well, what I wanted to pick up on is the point that Nina made about the mayor and about the people who are incorporating into the local economy, to say that one of the things that we're addressing is the fact that it's very hard to be successful in supporting refugees if you're not also explicitly thinking about engaging and supporting the host communities as well. So while a lot of the discussions often go towards the people who have come across a border, in the example of northern Jordan, for example, where I've spent time, 80% of the refugees are not in camps at all. They're living in towns like Mafraq and Irbid and any number of other places. And if you're not thinking about how you're going to support those host communities, you're not going to have success in facilitating integration into the communities for the refugees. The other important piece there is that often the notion people have is, well, the sooner that if we let people be too comfortable when they come into our country, they'll stay here forever. Well, actually, some preliminary research is showing the most likely indicator of someone going back to their home country is how well they did economically in the place where they went, which is a little bit counterintuitive. But the point is, almost everyone wants to go back home, unless they're a truly political refugee and it's not safe. The only way you're going to go back home to a place that perhaps has conflict or is war-torn is if you have some money accumulated to rebuild your home, to resettle, and so on. So again, thinking about how do we integrate people here in such a way that it supports the local community, supports local businesses where that cash is being spent, is core to being successful in supporting refugees when they move. In terms of the World Bank, we've done a couple of things which are new and are innovative for us. So as I said in the beginning, we're looking at partnership quite differently and how we can engage in this. And really, if you think about it, when you have the humanitarian world and the development world, they're really just two pieces of the same spectrum. They're helping people in different ways at different points in their lives or in their economic paths. The bank, for the first time, has created some facilities which allow wealthier countries, middle-income countries, to borrow from the bank in order to help some of these refugees who are coming into their countries and to help those countries as well. So specifically, for the first time, we created a facility called the Global Concessional Finance Facility that allows middle-income countries to borrow from us on a no-interest or concessional basis. Now, we had never done that before because the idea was if you were a middle-income country, you should be able to pay closer to market rates, even though we're cheaper than the market when you're borrowing for any number of things you want to do. In this instance, the Jordanians and Lebanese governments came to us and said, why should we keep piling up debt? We already have pretty high debt to GDP ratios when we're doing something which is a broader global public good and which is important that we do and we are doing whether we want to or not anyhow. And we said, well, that's actually makes a lot of sense, and so we created a facility which will support them, will bring all of our expertise and help them in design programs that'll help to absorb many of these refugees. From there, what we realized is that is very good, but of course there are many more refugees in Africa than there are in the Middle East, and a number of countries in that region are members of what's called IDA, which is our operating unit that lends and gives grants to the poorest countries in the world. So we are proposing and hoping to get funded through a replenishment that happens with all of the shareholders of the World Bank in the next couple of months, $2 billion extra dollars, which will go for IDA countries, the poorest countries in the world, who are absorbing refugees as well. And the thing to keep in mind there, of course, is that the oldest and largest refugee camp in the world is actually in Kenya. And people don't talk about that so much. And of course, there are refugees throughout the Great Lakes region, the Sahel region. Africa has been dealing with any number of these issues a little bit more out of the spotlight. And one of the important things we think is that we've got to shine that spotlight and help those countries as well as they absorb refugees. I would just say in closing This is part of an effort to think innovatively about how our capital can be most impactful. What I would say is that we think of ourselves as having bold capital. And I say that in the context of what Bob Rubin, the former Treasury Secretary, used to say, which is capital's a coward. And normally in fragile and conflict situations, investors don't want to go, people don't want to lend. What makes the bank different is we walk into those situations hopefully with an instrument that's helpful, and we've been trying to think about that more broadly, not just in the refugee situation, but also in thinking about pandemics. We've created an insurance product that countries can buy, so should a pandemic break out again like Ebola, we will get money very quickly on what's called a parametric basis. So instead of waiting and adding up what all the costs are and then paying a country, after a certain number of casualties, after a certain size earthquake, whatever it might be, a country gets the money right away. The point in a pandemic is that keeps the pandemic from taking off. So these are all new ways that I don't mean to take us too far afield into the pandemic world, but it's to say we're thinking about new ways that we can innovatively use our capital to address some of these broader transnational challenges that are out there. And that's a very long-winded way of answering a question about what we're trying to do to help some of these countries hosting refugees.
Let me just go just a little bit further about, so there's a hat passing exercise called every 3 years, and the shorthand in Washington is IDA 17 or IDA 18. And so you talked a little bit about this International Development Association ask, but in addition to the specific monies, isn't there also some additional agreement or focus that there's going to be the special low interest loans that the international community collects from countries, very generous countries like the United States or Germany or Japan or Canada, that those monies are going to be used to target specific countries in addition to some of the specific facilities or interventions that you talked about?
Well, we're going to make it available. Now, we have in mind that certain countries are more likely to come forward and ask for it. But the key with this $2 billion that I mentioned that we are hoping to raise from all the shareholders is that it is money that these countries can access separate from what they were normally going to access for whatever else they wanted to do to grow their development, separate and above. So the idea is if you're a country that's very poor and you're weighing, do we borrow in order to absorb these hundreds of thousands of people who have come across our border, or do we borrow to build roads we've always wanted to build or deepen a port? The idea is we don't want people to choose. We want people to be able to do what they were ordinarily going to do, plus to borrow to deal with the refugee situation. The thing I would say about this that's really important, you all are here in Washington, is this is really core to the U.S. needs to come with a very good contribution. People need to understand how important this is for our leadership in the world, but also for the bank, for its ability to go forward and do what it wants in conjunction with all the things we're doing bilaterally. And as an example, I would say at the bank, at the board, we're really pushing a lot of countries to come in for the first time. So Pakistan, which is not an extraordinarily wealthy country, for the first time is pledging that they're going to contribute to IDA. That's really important.
It's really great.
And that's the sort of thing that we hope to foster and we hope to see. And it's the kind of thing we need to keep in mind, that as the largest donor to IDA, historically over the bank's 70 years, we need to keep pushing other countries, and we need to make sure that we do the same and we maintain that leadership and continue to show significant support for these efforts.
I want to come back to that. So Jon, would you please explain a little bit about what are the gaps that you see in terms of the response to the refugee crisis? That would be the first question I'd ask you. And the second one is, I think we can all agree in this room that the challenge that we're talking about here is going to be with us for the next 8 to 10 years. So the next administration is going to have, this is going to be one of the things in the inbox. So if you were on the National Security Council staff, Jon, or having been on the National Security Council staff, or if you were a senior advisor to the aid administrator, or you were a policy advisor to Secretary of State, or you were an advisor to the new World Bank, the re-upped World Bank president. He just got re-upped. What would be some of the things you'd be wanting senior leaders to be thinking about?
It's always nice to be able to use the president's words rather than my own.
You're very diplomatic.
When I say he said we need resources. So his call was, of course, for the global community to step up and realize that even in the most fundamental sense, at the humanitarian level, we're not even meeting those needs.
So just let's double click on that, because I think there are asks by organizations like the World Food Program saying we need $100 worth of goods and money and cash. I don't think you're getting your 100% of your ask. Is that correct? There's the pledges and what you're actually getting in the door aren't the same
Right.
number. Is that correct?
For the refugee programs that we're managing right now, just to get us to the end of the year, we're really about $300 million short. So
Are
just
we
to-
are we in arrears? I'm hoping the United States is not in arrears.
the U.S. is never in arrears.
That's a good answer.
It's just,
Good.
it could step forward more, but it's never in arrears.
Okay.
But no, I think it's the president said we need more resources from more donors, from the private sector, from everybody needs to step up and realize this is a global issue. So that was number one. But I think one of the things, if I could just
Yes,
sort of
sir.
use your question, there's a tremendous amount of knowledge sharing going on, and the World Food Program works with the bank quite a bit on social safety nets, just as an example. And if we were able to expand investments in social safety nets, where we give the host governments the capacity to take care of first their own people with the basic needs, which we all take for granted, then by default those governments would have the ability and the systems in place to take care of refugees if they came in. So we wouldn't have to go in and build things. So there's certain longer term things that we could do as a global community to encourage countries, to give them technical capacity to build their own social safety net systems in their own model. But that would become a resource for all of us as we move forward. So it's a very big thing. And again, collaboration between the private sector and the bank and IFPRI and others on how best to do
What's
this.
IFPRI? Just for this
International
audience.
Food Policy Research Institute here in Washington, one of the biggest think tanks on food security. But in any event, these are the kinds of gaps that we need to fill globally, because if you were talking about pandemics, if we have basic healthcare systems in countries, then you have a much better sort of forecasting ability on when some disease might start popping up. And the sooner you know, the sooner you can act. So all of these things, again, the United States takes for granted, can actually be put in place at some level in every country in the world. And if you build off of that foundation, I think we'll see real improvement over time. So.
Okay, good. I want to just come back to Matt here, and I want you to, if you were in front of a congressional committee, could you just make the argument for why should the United States participate in the World Bank, A, and B, what is the argument for supporting IDA 18? I can give all the reasons why I think we should, but I think it would be important for you to share those, given the conversation we're having.
Sure. So I think fundamentally it's about global leadership and who America wants to be in the world. And I think historically we have been so central to the creation of the post-World War II international financial architecture. We were one of the core founders of the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the IMF. We've been central to thinking about any number of other multilateral institutions and making sure that they bring more and more countries into a global rules-based order that really is the benefit not only of our country but of so many other citizens around the world. And I would argue that the World Bank and many other like-minded institutions have been a core piece of helping to see those reductions in poverty that we've seen over time. So there's one issue which is really just about who are we as a country, what sort of values do we want to lead with, and it's important that we continue to stand strong on that. I think the other thing is that when we think about the stability of regions of the world, we have to think about the economic health of any number of countries around the world. The bank is full of economists and other experts across a wide range of fields which are working very closely with foreign governments who often call the World Bank when they need advice on how do we think about climate change, how do we think about having a more sustainable economy because we're seeing all these challenges, how do we think about this pandemic which is 2 countries away. So we want a World Bank and we want all that intellectual knowledge to be there. But then the final thing I'll say, and this is quoting a woman named Kristalina Georgieva, who's at the EU, she's former corporate secretary at the bank, and she wrote an article that I really enjoyed called Trouble Travels. And the other more self-interested thing to keep in mind is that if we don't address some of these fundamental issues where they reside, trouble travels, and we're all going to deal with it one way or another. Now, in many instances, there's a political solution we have to come up with, and that's part of the overall thinking. But in other instances, there are development or economic interventions that we can make, and it's really important if we want the world to operate in a way that we think works most effectively, that we're supportive of these institutions and that the U.S. continues to be strong and the rest of the world can see it. That's what I'd say.
Great. Nina, could you talk a little bit about, you have some really interesting corporate partnerships, and you talked about doing good and doing well. Just talk a little bit more about some of the organizations that you're working with, A, and then B, could you talk a little bit about what does Mastercard, when you partner with an organization like the World Bank or some part of the UN system, what are some of the things that you want that organization to understand about what Mastercard's capabilities are? Because I'm sure they oftentimes say, great, just write us a check, that would be great. But the conversation you were just describing, or the picture you described, the technology is a lot more powerful than just writing another check. So I'd be curious about that.
And I mean, most of our relationships are not about the check.
Yep.
I think a lot of it goes about the education, because people go, Mastercard, like, that's a credit card. Are you giving credit to people who really don't have money? So a lot of it goes about not only educating people on the first thing from a financial institution perspective, but also why are we doing this? We also look at financial inclusion, which a lot of this stems into from a broader perspective, saying the 6 billion people which are not connected in the economy today, what is the actual impact of that? And then we look into a deep end, we're going, when people are not connected, they might not be connected from being able to keep their funds safe, but are they connected to power? Are they connected to electricity? Do they have water? What does all of that look like, and how can we help build those ecosystems? We're all about building a better tomorrow, and with partnerships, we can really do that. In Africa, we speak, there's an acronym that we use there, and we speak about, if you want to go fast, go on your own. If you want to go far, go together and go in a group. And that's what we were doing here. We're getting the right partners in a group, and we're getting like-minded thinking people together to saying, how do we do this? Okay? Whether it's the likes of Unilever, Facebook, World Bank, WFP, Mercy Corps, we're all trying to make the world a better place. And we can do it a lot more efficiently when we're doing it together, and we can leverage it. Mastercard has got an astronomical footprint from a global perspective. How do we connect? What does our network look like? And if you actually think about the world, we have got it in a net already. We've got the connectivity points. We can reach people really quickly. We manage to move quickly. We can move, whether it be financials, whether it be commodities, we've got a network to support that. Okay? We're present in over 200 countries. So all of that makes a huge impact on what do we bring to the party. And while we've got the footprint there, we've also got the insights. We've got the data, we can understand what's needed there, and we can help, and we're prepared to bring that. And we're doing it from a sustainability perspective. Sure, we've got the Mastercard Foundation, which does it from a philanthropic perspective. We've got the Mastercard Center, which looks at it from a much different perspective. And then we've got the commercial side of the business, where we're going, things need to be sustainable. If you do things for free, they are not sustainable. Okay? However, you do not have to charge premium prices, and if everybody can still make and do things more efficiently, it works, and it becomes sustainable and becomes repetitive.
Thank you. Jon, we were having a conversation at lunch about the merging of development and humanitarian response. Could you talk a little bit about how that's happening, and what does that mean for the World Food Program? What do you think that means for other organizations? And I'd like Matt to also comment on that from the World Bank perspective.
I think the big change is that in the past, organizations were happy to, just do their job. If they delivered their food or they delivered their supplies or whatever, that was the job well done. And now there's really a recognition that life is much more dynamic than that, and we have power in the resources that we provide, and we need to use them fully. So as I used just the example, with the right tool, the card, instead of handing out food and just doing nothing to stimulate anything beyond giving people a resource, the card gives a resource, it gives choice, it gives dignity, so it's already tripled its value, and then it stimulates the market. I would argue that when the market is happy and the community is therefore happy, there's more stability. You don't have as much resentment of people taking over things or us coming in and replacing systems. So the humanitarian community has to be much more focused on development. And even in WFP's fundamental work with food assistance, we have to really understand markets, not just who needs assistance, but how they need assistance, how that assistance can add value to the market structure, to transportation systems, to everything. So, and then can it contribute to technical assistance? If we're doing a school feeding program in a country and we're not helping the government learn how to take that system over, then we're going to be there forever. If we teach them how to run their own program, they can take it over. And more importantly, if we can integrate local agriculture into that program, then it becomes, again, something the community values. The kids are going to school, the farmers are selling their goods, the government's getting recognition for providing a service to a community. So these are broader things, way beyond just the humanitarian action. They have developmental impact, and we all need to continue to look at how we can use our resources in a much more dynamic way.
How's this impacting at the World Bank Group?
So first would be some of the things I mentioned earlier, the financial innovations that are moving us to think about how we deploy our capital more creatively. So that's one piece. And then the other thing I would say is deepening into different sorts of partnerships like those that Jon and Nina have talked about. That's another piece. And I think the third is just thinking about what are we learning, what are we seeing out there that ought to shape the way we do things. So I'll use two quick examples that perhaps people wouldn't think of when they think of the World Bank. First is picking up on the issue of basic nutrition and feeding people. We have come to realize through tons of research, not just the banks, but James Heckman out at UChicago and a number of other places, the importance of early childhood nutrition on basic cognitive development and how important it is that children get the right nutrients when they're very, very young. Why does this matter? Well, it matters because from a development perspective, an awful lot of countries where we work have 40, 45, 50% of their children who are stunted, meaning have low height and weight, which ties very closely into cognitive development. Well, it's hard to see how an economy really thrives if 45 to 50% of your children are stunted. What we've seen through some of our programs in Latin America are reductions by half of stunting over the course of 10 years. So in Peru, for example, over the last 10 years, building on a program called Bolsa Familia, which I believe you were part of getting together way back when with the Brazilians, Jon, yep. We've been able to reduce stunting in Peru from 28% to 14%. That is really remarkable and it's important, and it's something we're trying to do more broadly, and then tying it into how that fits with strengthening institutions more broadly. And so that's the other piece I would touch on, is that's what we actually know how to do well, and we've done for many years. And so the question is, how do we then strengthen the rest of the educational system so it's more connected to where the world economy is going and so on. And one other example I would use is in the context of that, how do we utilize new technologies? I think of Mastercard really as a great payment platform. Now, sure, a lot of people think of it as a credit card company, but they do payments and transferring of money as well as anybody. So the question is, why does that matter from a development perspective? The reason is, in some countries, I'll use India as an example where I was recently, there are an awful lot of benefits that are now going out in a digital mode, which reduces leakage or the possibility that it ends up in the hands of someone else to the tune of billions and billions of dollars. That's a country with an awful lot of poor people that wants to change that, who can now use those billions of dollars to come back to the bank and say, what's the next project that you all think might have the biggest impact, and we can get in that discussion and use that money more effectively somewhere else. So the point is that there are all sorts of innovations which are taking place as we understand the linkages between what are traditionally more humanitarian fields, what are traditionally more private sector activities, to overall economic health and growth, the more effective we can be in advising countries, and to get back to the point you asked about a minute ago, really promoting a lot of the values that we think here in the U.S. can make a difference around the world.
Great. All right, this has been a very patient audience. Thank you all for being here. I see a lot of thoughtful people in the room. I first want to call on my friend Andrea Koppel from Mercy Corps, who's here. Aaron, please give my friend Andrea the microphone. Andrea, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Dan. I guess my question is for Matt, rather. Also in IDA 18, there's a $2.5 billion carve-out for the private sector. Could you elaborate on how that's going to work and how the bank is going to ensure that, because the money will be going into these fragile countries where often there aren't functioning institutions and whatnot, but how you'll make sure that the money is going where it's supposed to go. Thank you.
And I want to take advantage of that. I want to ask Jon, I'd like you to answer the question, how do you work with NGOs like Mercy Corps on responding to emergencies? And then Nina, I'd like you to answer, how do you work with NGOs and partner with them? Because you've talked about how you partner with multilateral institutions. I'd welcome how you partner with NGOs like Mercy Corps. So go ahead.
Well, thanks for the question, Andrea. A couple of things. One, I have to be really, really clear. The U.S. Congress has not appropriated the money for IDA yet, so these are all proposals that the bank is coming forward with. We're in the midst of discussions, and we're quite hopeful that all of these things will be realized. And I would mention again that we're but one of the countries. While we're the largest contributor to IDA over the years, any number of other countries, dozens, are contributing as well. So this is a longer and more involved process, and I don't want people to leave here thinking all of this is locked in and done. There's real work to come. In terms of the private sector window, as it's called, about a third of the bank's lending and investments go directly to the private sector. The other 2/3 go to governments, whether they're middle income or lower income countries. That's through something called the IFC, the International Finance Corporation. So that's business that we've been doing, and when you think about, and what it goes to are companies that are doing things which increase economic development in any number of the countries where we work. We operate in about 120 countries. So that's something we've already been doing. As you might expect, and to your point, where you tend to have stronger institutions, more creditworthy banks, and more reliable regulatory environments tend to be in slightly wealthier countries. The IFC has not done as much in poorer IDA countries over time. This is an effort to set aside money specifically to push harder on that front. And one of the things that I would cite is there's a book recently by a woman named Caroline Freund called Rich People, Poor Countries, that talks about how you really grow the economies of very poor countries. She has some fascinating statistics showing that about 30 to 50% of exports in many developing countries come from the 5 largest companies in those countries. The point of which is if you can identify the local entrepreneurs who are really growing rapidly and support them, you're going to see huge hiring and job growth over time. And so that's part of what IFC is hoping to do, is say how do we identify those companies, really help them to expand. And then importantly, how do we also show, again, being the more bold capital, how do we show other investors that the IFC is in there, we've made good money, and other people may be enticed to come in as well. The final thing I'll say is in the course of that, and this goes to the final question you were asking, is we don't just go in and lend money for project finance or to invest in a healthcare company or anything of that sort. It always goes with advice. So we always say we have financial capital and intellectual capital, and we bring them both together. So for example, if it's very hard to start a business, if it's very hard to export because of all sorts of customs regulations, those are the discussions we're having in parallel with the investment so that we can improve the investment climate and the business climate generally. And you might know we have a doing business report, which gets a lot of attention every year, which ranks countries on any number of indicators like energy provision, how regular it is, how long it takes to start a business, whether or not you can declare bankruptcy, whether or not one has an easy time in resolving disputes, all these other things. And that's a tool we have to point the light at different countries and say, here's some things you ought to be working on to improve over time. So it's part of a much more comprehensive effort, but it's one that we think is quite timely, and we're hopeful that all the shareholders come in and really allow IFC to do even more in those poorest countries because it's so important for our overall mission.
So Jon, could you talk a little bit about how do you work with a network of partners like, there's a whole universe of nonprofit organizations, civil society groups. You must work with them to do your work at the World Food Program. Is that correct?
We do indeed, and I think people would say, oh, the NGOs, they're the last mile implementers for WFP, and while that's true in one context, there's so much more, and I think it's. When we talk about innovation, a lot of times the NGOs are the incubators for some of the most creative innovation out there. And I even think in the case of the cash-based transfers and debit cards and things, it was the NGO community that really began investigating that and testing it early on. What WFP can do with the NGO community and other partners is take these things to scale. So I would say that we have the symbiotic relationship. One wouldn't work well without the others. We're also implementing partners, so we do need them for, in many cases, the last mile. But it's just one facet of the need to partner in this new environment. And we have the NGOs we need to partner with. We have the private sector we need to partner with. Our partnership with UNHCR and refugee response is just almost... we're practically married because they set the standards for targeting, but we have a lot of the implementation tools, so we have to work back and forth with them all the time. And again, it wouldn't work without them. So don't ever think of it as a simple relationship. It's a very dynamic relationship and one that we're going to rely on for a long time.
Nina, talk about how you work with nonprofit organizations as part of what you're doing in the context of refugees.
Sure. So, I mean, every crisis is different. Every country is different. Every need is different. And that's how we approach it. We haven't gone with a one product or one solution fits all. So therefore, it requires that we understand what are they trying to do, how quickly do they need to do it, and what is the pain point that they're trying to solve. And based on that, we go in and help solve that problem. Whether it be something where it's out in the middle of nowhere, where there's no connectivity, we've got specific products specifically for that. How do they get stuff there? How do they get the ecosystem to work? How do they build that up? Or whether it be in a mainstream country where they're going, we want to get people money, but they need access to cash. How do we do that? And we literally go in and we look at it, and I wouldn't say customize, but we understand the need and we build accordingly. And we assist them to get that out there. It's costing the NGOs money at the moment to get stuff out there. The difference is whether it costs them $5 or $1. It's a difference between it's going to take them 2 weeks to get something out or whether we can do it in 24 hours. It's a difference of whether they need 50 people to get it out there or whether they need one person to get it out there. Those are the things that we look at. We look at the efficiencies. We look at the insights that we can bring to them through data, through system build, partnerships. Who else do we need to bring? In many cases, we're also seen as a market organizer, bringing the right people together to make sure that it works.
Great, thank you. Other questions and comments from this thoughtful audience? Yes, please. This woman here.
Thank you very much. My name is Yeshim. I'm with the United Nations Development Program here in Washington. Great pleasure. I wish we'd met before in person. I'm inspired by your experience, of course. There's two questions perhaps that I'd like to raise. One is local authorities. A lot of our experience is that the burden and the onus of responding not only to the host community grievances but also to the incoming communities, say it in Jordan or in Turkey, in Lebanon, is sitting with local communities. How are we working together with the local communities? That's one area that I'd like to ask. And the second is, thank you so much for sharing the experience. We've read a lot about the partnership between Mastercard and WFP. One of the most successful, or all the successful social assistance programs in any developing country are the ones that empower the women with the card, actually. So it's not only the incoming populations, but also the Jordanian woman in northern Jordan. If she has the card, she's also equally empowered. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about how the broader development work that we all partner together already, but on the host communities and using the technologies. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So I might start quickly on that, and it's not just being a world banker. I have to always go back to the economic points here, and I would say that it's not just the empowerment that we see when women get the money directly, but we see a huge increase in expenditures on health and education for their families, which has a big long-term economic benefit, obviously. So it's also a matter of, if you design a program effectively and move money directly into women's hands, what you often get is ancillary benefits that are quite significant, and that's part of why we think about design along those lines. I would say in terms of working with local officials, you're exactly right, and I'll just give you my experience. So when we were in northern Jordan, I've been there twice, certainly we make sure to meet with the appropriate ministers in Amman, but when we're up in Irbid and Mafraq and the other towns up there that I talked about, it's the mayors. We just sit with the mayors and hear what they want. And we ask those questions, what would be most useful to you? And this gets back to why it's so important that we strengthen the host communities, because obviously they're worried about their core constituents, who are people who have lived in Jordan for many years. They also are drawing on the decades of experience in that instance of Jordan absorbing refugees for a long, long time. So obviously for 40, 50 years, they've been absorbing Palestinian immigrants and any number of others. So you draw on their experience, you hear exactly what is most beneficial from them, and then that helps us to shape the overall design, even if we end up lending to the national entity ultimately. So this is core, and it's part of what the bank team, some of whom are here, have learned over many years in how we design and have the greatest impact.
Is the World Bank able to lend directly to cities or to subnational governments?
We do an awful lot of work with subnational entities. There is a gray area in some of the regulations, and so we're looking into that, and there are cases where we have, absolutely, in the past. It's something we have to navigate a bit, but yes, there are mechanisms through which we can do that. The question is where and how is that the best opportunity. One of the things I would say, also to be frank, is that in many cases, especially in poorer or more fragile countries, the municipalities just are not that strong. And so the question is, do they have the capacity to absorb this money? Are there ways we can go in and help build some of those municipal entities in such a way that over time they will be stronger, much like Jon was saying on the food side, but it's really a case by case where we have to think carefully and see what makes the most sense.
So, Jon, this issue of local authorities, how does WFP work with local governments, both at the national level, and I'd be curious also at the city government level or the subnational government level?
Well, I think we have a very intensive engagement at all levels, and as I pointed out, we're working with obviously the government of Lebanon, but we're working with their banking sector. We're working with the local government employees, if you will, to teach them how to track the refugee data, if you will, so they are able to report what's going on in their own community and to understand it. And then in another way, we're asking the community to help identify Lebanese vulnerable families so that it's not just, we're providing assistance to the Syrian refugees. So there is this need to not only constantly assess who the vulnerable are among the refugees, but also who the vulnerable are in the local community. And then everybody has a better understanding of how the assistance helps the whole community. So there's a lot of work that's done, and UNHCR, of course, does a huge amount of it as well, so it's certainly not just WFP. But the last comment is we're also working with the universities in the area because we want them to help us understand what's happening in the community. So there's all sorts of outreach going on because we don't claim to know everything that's happening there. We need the locals to help us understand what's happening in the community and better guide us.
Jon, let me just go a little bit further. I think there's a bias in diplomacy, there's a bias in development to do capital-to-capital engagement. And we had a conversation about urbanization earlier today. Nina painted a very stark picture in her conversation with the mayor in Athens. So what is World Food Programme's ability to deal directly with mayors or subnational governments? Do you have to get a permission slip to go to the national government? Can you go directly to a mayor? Or do you have to get, so I know there's some, I'm not sure that AID, I don't know what AID's arrangement is. If I recall correctly, I think it's very difficult unless you have an agreement with the national government to go directly to.
WFP always has an agreement with the national government.
No, I understand.
Okay, I'm just saying, so we have our blanket agreement, which basically lets us engage pretty much depending on the country, it's sometimes more controlled than others, but for the most part, engage at whatever level we think.
I'm making this up, but let's say the national government is Red Sox and the city government is Yankees. Okay? I'm using deep, sophisticated think tank talk here, okay, Jon? But it seems to me that there are times in many developing countries, I can name many examples, where the opposition party or the city government is controlled by one party and the national government is controlled by another, and that somehow colors the conversation, even in terrible emergencies.
Yeah, it can.
So could you just, I'd just like to just go a little bit further and just push a little bit further. Do you have the ability to deal directly with mayors? If they say, I don't want you talking to that mayor, what does WFP say if a national government says that? Or I don't want you dealing with the city government, I want you dealing with the national government. Do you have the ability to say no?
Well, it's complicated, Dan. I wish I could say there was a simple answer, but
because
honestly,
my sense is that I don't think the World Bank and the other MDBs have enough capacity to work with city and subnational governments. They have to work.
Well, can I just say
there's a sense that whether it's AID or the MDBs or whether it's the UN system, there's a heavy bias towards capitals and national governments. Yes, there are examples of subnational government financing, but I've been of the belief that we're going to need more permission slips or some kind of ability to work directly with city governments, given some of the changes in sort of the emergencies, the changes in urbanization. But because of things, my Red Sox and Yankees example, this is actually a real issue.
I would just say that what WFP would do is not say we need to speak to an official. We need to meet with the people who can give us the information to help us get the job done, which the national government, you presume, hopefully, would want to have addressed. So
we all presume and we all hope they'd want it to be addressed.
Again, it depends on the context. But for
Right.
the most part, you say we need to get into this area, we need to talk to these people, we need to understand the situation, and it's assumed or presumed that you're going to talk to the local officials to get that information. But hey, the world's difficult, and sometimes it doesn't go the way you want.
Okay.
If I could just put a plug in for WFP and hopefully for the bank, but certainly for these guys. I mean, part of that goes to reputation. And if national governments have found the WFP, which I think they have over time, as fair and honest brokers and interlocutors, they often have more latitude than some countries would on a bilateral basis. So this goes back to the importance of multilateral entities, because they do tend to have a different sort of credibility. And I would argue that in an awful lot of places, we can point to success and say, we just did this in Maharashtra, which has 200 million people. That's not a small country, that's a large country. And that's just one state in India. So if we can take that and then go to another country and say, here's where we worked with a mayor or governor, here's what worked, and here's how it happened, and here's how we did it. And by the way, you didn't read any news stories about us putting our thumb on one political party's scale or the others, then people start to nod their head, and you're able to go to the next one. So I agree the world is hard, but it's also why we have to maintain the integrity and the brand or reputation, if you will, of a number of these multilaterals over time.
Good. Okay. Yes, please. These two folks up here on this side of the. Start with this woman here, and then this one over here. Yeah.
Hi, Milady Gilarte with USAID. My question is more about corruption. To what extent is that built into your framework of assistance? We deal with it at USAID.
How do you think about corruption?
Correct, and also in the context of financing for development and the SDGs, that we see that day to day, and how the Hill is consistently making us more accountable, as we should, right, to taxpayers' money. So I was wondering, in your different setting, how you built that into your assistance.
Great. We'll do this World Bank style, and we'll collect a couple of questions. I would like to have this woman here, because I'm going to come back to the issue of corruption. This one over here. Yeah.
Hi, my question was, what role do you see more traditional aid aid programs, like food airdrops, what role do you see them playing? Do you plan on kind of integrating them into the more innovative things, like when monetizing markets? Do you want to integrate credit into it, credit cards or prepaid cards into it? What role do you see that playing?
Okay, great. Anyone else? Okay, we'll take these two. Okay, so issue of corruption, great question. In all three of these institutions, I think would be interesting to hear from each of you. So why don't we start with you, Matt? When you think about, especially in emergency responses, the issue of corruption is certainly something that one has to be careful of. So I know that the World Bank has spent a lot of time over the last 20 years thinking about issues of corruption, both in its practices, but also the issue of trying to reduce corruption in the countries where it's working.
So part of this goes to, you're absolutely right, and certainly USAID is aware of the challenges that come with corruption. It's something we've been grappling with for a long time. I would say a couple of things. One, we have a group of safeguards, which are the conditions upon which we lend to countries, and that hopefully protect us by ensuring that certain studies are done, that there's certain evaluation and monitoring that happens, by doing due diligence on who exactly ends up with the money, any number of other things we try to institute right from the start to reduce the likelihood of a World Bank project getting tainted by corruption. Now, it's not perfect, but we think we have a good system in place, and we're always trying to improve that. We just passed a new set of safeguards this last year, which hopefully will strengthen that and minimize the number of times where we get hit with corruption challenges. I would say the other thing that we do to approach this is really utilize our knowledge networks, or the way that we can explain to one country what a drag corruption is on their economy, by drawing on examples from other economies, and by showing when you eliminate this, you just see many more benefits, you see the growth that you're all aiming for, and so on. So part of it too is really going back to that research, that intellectual capital, and trying to make the case. But I would say at the end of the day, it's hard. People sometimes act in real direct self-interest ways that are problematic, and you have to also be attuned to it. So the final thing we have in place are a number of accountability mechanisms, inspection panels, and other things where if someone sees corruption, they can come to an independent body within the bank and have that investigated. And then hopefully over time people realize that if it's bank money, you have to play by a strong set of rules and stay away from that. I will not address the other question just yet, unless you want us to touch on both of them before we go down there.
No, yeah. Why don't we deal first with the corruption, and then we'll come back to this issue of that's a good way to do that. So Jon, you work in some really tough places with weak states or non-existent states. How do you make sure that somebody's not taking an extra bag of rice? How do you make sure that somebody's not taking all the food and giving it to their militia as opposed to giving it to people? How do you make sure people aren't taking commodities and then turning around and selling it on markets and keeping the money for themselves? So this issue of corruption, I'm sure, is something you must think about every day.
Yeah, we do think about it every day, and it's, as you say, it's in some of the places where we work, it's very hard, and none of the organizations can ever withstand sort of, a report that they were involved or they had some corruption going on. But I think what we always do is we have the monitoring systems that we put in place for the traditional programs, but I'm going to just segue over to the newer Mastercard type activities. Not only do we have biometrics to ensure we're giving cards to the right people, and that we're not giving cards to them twice. Which
that was actually one of the questions I was going to ask Nina. Is like how I had visions of going 5 or 6 times and getting 5 or 6 of those cards, and that. So I'm quite curious about it.
So the biometrics really have taken care of that, and in the case of one of the camps in Kenya, we saw 15 or 20% cleansing, if you will. So it's
Sorry,
really.
cleansing?
Where we eliminated duplication, where people had multiple cards and things.
Really?
Oh yeah. So this new technology has given us the ability to reduce corruption, if you will, or misuse of resources, but it also adds to our ability to know what people are buying, to know how they're using their money, to help us better understand what their needs are. And as Nina says, if we see that there's a spike in I guess payment to education or payment to medicine or something like that, or rent, we can see that there are increasing demands in a sector that we might not have been aware of. That's not a corruption issue, but it is a making sure we can fine-tune our programming to make sure it has the greatest impact. So the new technologies are giving us the ability to do things, and even in, again, we can use these cards even when there's a food distribution, and they can still allow you to make sure that the person is the right person. The biometric link still works. So it still works in the old food distribution programs too, where they're appropriate. But corruption is a huge issue that everybody has to watch for all the time, but I like to see that the new technologies are really giving us the ability to tighten it up. And then of course we don't do that much with host governments directly, so that would be an issue, but it's not.
So Nina, when you were telling the example, I had the exact vision of someone going and getting 5 or 6 cards, and so it sounds as if there are ways you can safeguard against that.
Absolutely. So I'm going to go slightly off the refugee topic and actually speak about a real example in South Africa, where we've got a government program by the name of SASSA, and South Africa in total is a really small country. When it launched in 2012, we had a population of about 58 million people. But of that, 16 million people were receiving social grants. And before that, government were predominantly distributing the social grants in cash and checks, and it was costing them about $3.66 per social grant. They then moved over onto a product, a Mastercard debit card, which had biometrics on it as well. We launched it in partnership with a Grindrod Bank and Net1. And what that basically did from a cost perspective, when we brought it down to $1.60 for disbursement, we managed to help government save a total of about $375 million over 5 years. And we called that operational savings. Because of the way the costing worked, it came down, and also it allowed for multiple grants to be paid out in one card. So ideally, if I was the grandmother getting an old age grant, and these were my 3 children, and I was receiving child support grants, government was no longer paying $3.66 times 4, they were only paying $1.60. That's about the efficiency side. Then we speak about the corruption side, okay? Haven't found a country yet where there's not a problem with ghost collectors, people who have passed away, multiple grant collectors, and whether that be adults or children. And in South Africa, again, because of this program, we managed to eradicate 850,000 illegal grant collectors. And that's estimated of bringing a saving of another 350 million. So we're speaking about a specific country there, not necessarily a refugee program, but that's a true example of how technology can come into partnership and really make things work and bring efficiency.
Great, thanks. Let me move back to John, and the woman in the middle of the row had a question about the nexus of traditional assistance, humanitarian response, new technologies. Why don't you start off in answering that question, John, given that this is sort of your world, if you will.
Mm-hmm. So it was a little bit of a mixed question. I mean, some of the more innovative delivery technologies that WFP has, airdrops and flutter drops and all these kinds of things, they're going to be in the repertoire for forever. We've used them recently in Southern Sudan again, or South Sudan, and we continue to innovate in those areas. But they are, as we move to more local and regional procurement, as we move to cash-based systems, there's less of a need for that, except in those very violent emergencies. I think you've probably been to the berm in Jordan. I wouldn't call it really so much of an innovation, but there's a big crane that delivers assistance from the Jordanian side to the Syrian side of the border. It's kind of a sad situation, but you do what you do to get the resources there. So we'll keep innovating. We'll keep trying to figure out ways to make sure commodities get where they're going. But I think the new technology is opening up a world that we really couldn't imagine just a few years ago.
Do you want to comment on that, Matt?
No.
Okay.
I would like to comment on that. I think with regards to your question and why are people moving to new technologies, I think there's a new understanding of that even when in-kind is happening, there are times when it's more disruptive than what it's doing good. And when you speak about in-kind being dropped into a community, a small community, then often the person who has had the small mom and pop shop or the sorry in the area moves, because there's no longer a need for him to be there. And when the aid is no longer needed and the aid organization moves away, there's nobody left for the local community to support and get what they need. Versus when you're building an economy from scratch and you're saying, here's a card, you go and support and build that local economy, that mom and pop shop is probably going to start thriving. They're going to start holding on a larger variety of goods, be able to support the community in a lot more meaningful way, and you'll probably find new shops coming up as well. So there's a time and a place when there's in-kind need, and there's a time and a place where we're going to be doing more good by going digital and giving people the opportunity to actually build their own economy and getting sustainability for tomorrow.
Great, thank you very much. Questions or comments from the audience? Well, this is really been great. I really appreciate you all coming out for this. I really want to thank the panelists. This has really been a very interesting conversation. Please join me in thanking the panelists.